Where angels feared to tread, there you'd find a human ready and raring. Brian Henderson slumped on a bar stool in some god-awful dive on Benos Station. He'd lifted so many glasses that the counter was more scuffed than his knuckles. A hooded form approached through the smoky dimness. "I'm looking for Brian Henderson," the figure said, "the one they call humanity's greatest explorer." The hood drew back to reveal no human face but an alien one, denobulan if he had to guess, pale blue with two drooping tentacles framing her mouth. She had the look of a scientist, not the usual riffraff you'd find around these parts. "I am Ilara," she said calmly. "My people need your help desperately. We found something, a planet, emitting energy like we've never seen, but none who land there ever return." She looked at him intently. "They say where humans dare to go, none can follow. Will you help us uncover its secrets?" Brian chuckled darkly. "Lady, there's always a catch." He drained his whiskey. "But I haven't had a challenge worth a damn in years. I'll take your little milk run." As he strode from the bar to round up a crew crazy enough, his gut turned. That Ilara broad wasn't telling him something. He smelled danger coming off this job like stink on a weak-dead Thorian bantha. But that was the thing about humans. When the odds were long and the stakes were high, when catastrophe was assured and angels kept their distance, that's when humans thrived. As the Odyssey sliced through the void of space, Brian couldn't shake a nagging sense of unease in his gut. He'd faced his fair share of danger in his explorations, but this felt different. It was subtle at first. Flickering lights, momentary power fluctuations, little glitches that could easily be dismissed. But as the journey wore on, the incidents grew more frequent and harder to ignore. Jack, the ship's engineer, worked tirelessly to diagnose the issues, but each time he thought he'd found the source, it seemed to slip through his fingers like smoke. The crew grew restless, whispers of strange dreams and phantom voices echoing through the corridors at night. Brian knew he needed answers. He pulled up a secure channel and hailed Ilara. Her image flickered to life on the screen, her pale blue features etched with concern. Ilara hesitated, her tentacles twitching nervously. There's something I didn't tell you before. When we discovered the energy signal on Zeta Prime, we sent scouts to investigate. They found an artifact, ancient and alien, unlike anything we'd ever seen." She took a shuddering breath. But when they tried to study it, the artifact, it did something, a pulse of energy, blinding and powerful, and when it faded, the scouts were gone. Vanished, without a trace. Brian leaned forward, his brow furrowed. "And you want us to what, go fetch this thing for you? After what it did to your people?" "Please, you must understand," Ilara pleaded. "We believe this artifact could be the key to our survival. If we could just study it, harness its power." Brian cut the feed, leaning back in his chair with a heavy sigh. He'd known there was more to this than met the eye, but an ancient alien doomsday device, that was a new one, even for him. As the Odyssey approached Zeta Prime, the crew gathered on the bridge, transfixed by the sight before them. The planet was hauntingly beautiful, its atmosphere a swirl of iridescent colors that pulsed and shimmered like a living thing. But there was something unsettling about it, a sense of wrongness that set Brian's teeth on edge. They entered orbit, the ship's scanners probing the planet's surface. It didn't take long to locate the energy signal's source, a network of deep, winding tunnels that burrowed into the planet's crust like the lair of some monstrous beast. As they prepared to descend into the unknown, Brian couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking into a nightmare. But he was human, and this was what humans did. They ventured into the darkness, into the jaws of hell itself, in search of answers, and in search of glory. The shuttle touched down at the mouth of the tunnels, an obsidian maw that seemed to swallow the meager light whole. Brian, Jack, and Ethan stepped out onto the alien soil, their suits' external lights casting eerie shadows across the twisted rock formations. In the distance, the pulsing glow of the artifact beckoned them forward, a siren song of power and terror. Into the black maw of the caves they went, the Raven's engines fading to a distant hum as they descended. Brian, Jack, and Ethan switched on their flashlights, beams cutting through a darkness that seemed to press in from all sides. There was a stillness down here, an unnatural quiet that set Brian's nerves on edge. Only the occasional distant rumble from deep within the planet broke the silence, like the growl of some slumbering beast. As they stepped out of the Raven, their boots crunched on loose gravel and debris. The beams of their flashlights swept across the remnants of the Denobulan camp, scattered equipment and abandoned machinery, telling a chilling tale. It was as if the occupants had simply vanished in the middle of their daily routines, leaving behind half-eaten meals and still-running equipment. "What the hell happened here?" Jack muttered, his voice sounding unnaturally loud in the stillness. Brian shook his head, a sense of unease crawling up his spine. "Nothing good, that's for sure. Keep your eyes peeled and your weapons ready." They made their way deeper into the tunnels, the ancient alien walls seeming to pulse with an eerie energy. The further they ventured, the stronger the signal grew, their handheld scanners beeping with increasing urgency. Suddenly a piercing scream tore through the tunnels, echoing off the walls and sending chills down their spines. It was a sound of pure, primal terror, and it was close. Without hesitation, they sprinted towards the source, hearts pounding in their chests. But as they rounded a corner, they found themselves facing a dead end, the screams abruptly cut off and leaving only silence in their wake. Brian felt a cold sweat breaking out on his forehead. Something was very wrong here, and every instinct he had was screaming at him to turn back. But they had come too far to give up now. Steeling himself, he motioned for the others to follow. "We keep going, but stay alert. I have a feeling we're not alone down here." They pressed on, the tunnels twisting and turning like the guts of some monstrous beast. Every shadow seemed to hold a hidden threat, every sound a potential warning of danger. And then, as they rounded another corner, they saw it. A creature, twisted and grotesque, a nightmarish fusion of organic matter and advanced technology. It was like nothing they had ever seen before, all pulsing flesh and gleaming metal, with eyes that glowed with a sickly, malevolent light. For a moment, they stood frozen in shock and horror, and then the creature lunged, a scream of fury tearing from its throat as it closed the distance between them in a heartbeat. In the cramped confines of the tunnel, the battle was fierce and desperate. The creature was strong, far stronger than any human, and its flesh seemed to absorb their weapons' fire like water. They fought with everything they had, but it was like fighting a force of nature, relentless and unstoppable. Brian felt a white-hot pain lance through his shoulder as the creature's claws found their mark, tearing through his suit like paper. He stumbled back, his vision blurring at the edges as he struggled to stay on his feet. Through the haze of pain, he saw Jack go down, the creature's jaws clamping down on his leg with a sickening crunch. Ethan was firing wildly, his shots going wide in the chaos, the muzzle flashes strobing off the tunnel walls like a madman's disco. Brian gritted his teeth, forcing himself back to his feet. He knew they couldn't win this fight, not here, not like this. They had to fall back, regroup, come up with a plan. Ethan hesitated for a moment, his eyes wide with fear and indecision, but then he nodded, holstering his weapon and hauling Jack's limp form over his shoulder. As they stumbled back down the tunnel, the creature's screams of rage echoing behind them, Brian knew that this was only the beginning. They had stirred up something ancient and terrible, and it would not rest until it had claimed them all. But he was human, and he would not go down without a fight. As they staggered into the Raven, battered and bleeding but alive, Brian knew that the real battle was just beginning. And he would be ready for it, come hell or high water. Brian, Jack, and Ethan staggered back from the grotesque creature, chests heaving, weapons still smoking. The thing lay crumpled and twitching, ichor oozing from shattered cybernetics. Brian winced, clutching his shredded shoulder. "You boys still breathing?" Pained groans were his only reply. They were alive, but far from unscathed. Jack limped over to the fallen monstrosity, shining his light over mangled features. He recoiled. "Holy hell, it's the Denobulans! What's left of them, anyway?" A chill scraped down Brian's spine. This was the fate that awaited them if they failed, twisted, corrupted, inhuman. Ethan's scanner chirped urgently, the energy signal pulsing like a migraine in their skulls. No choice but to press on. The tunnels yawned wider, opening into a vast cavern. At its heart a towering monolith of rippling geometries and searing light, the artifact. It shimmered with opalescent menace, the air around it thrumming with coiled power. "Lord Almighty," Brian breathed. Every instinct screamed to run, yet his feet dragged inexorably forward, the others shambling behind in a daze. A discordant hum emanated from the structure, burrowing into their minds, vibrating in their molars. Closer, closer. Ethan lurched ahead, glassy-eyed, hand outstretched. "Ethan, don't!" Brian cried. Too late. Ethan's fingers brushed the iridescent surface, and an invisible hammer blow hurled him back like a rag doll. He hit the ground hard and lay still. The monolith pulsed faster, brighter, its surface running molten. Shock waves thrashed the cavern. A blinding flare erupted from the artifact, searing Brian's retinas. He cried out, shielding his eyes. "We have to get out of here now," Jack yelled. The chamber quaked, rock cracking and crumbling. This whole place was coming down. They ran, stumbling and scrambling, lungs searing. The tunnels writhed around them, morphing as if alive. Brian's boots pounded, the bone-trembling roar of collapsing stone hot on their heels. There, ahead, a sliver of blessed daylight. Brian and Jack burst from the tunnel's maw, stumbling into the eerie light of Zeta Prime's surface. Their lungs burned, hearts racing as they gulped down the alien air. The ground still trembled beneath their boots, a low rumble that set their teeth on edge. Jack nodded, his face pale and drawn. They limped towards the landing site, the Raven a welcome sight amidst the chaos. But as they drew closer, a flicker of movement caught Brian's eye. He tensed, hand dropping to his sidearm. From the shadows emerged a group of Denobulan soldiers, their weapons trained on the battered humans. At their head stood Ilara, her once pristine lab coat now stained and tattered. Her eyes glittered with a cold, calculating light. "Brian Henderson," she said, her voice flat and devoid of emotion, "you have something that belongs to me." Brian's jaw tightened. "The artifact, is that what this was all about? You lied to us, Ilara. People died down there." She shrugged, a dismissive gesture. "A necessary sacrifice. The power within that artifact could change the course of history, and I intend to claim it." Brian shook his head, disbelief and anger warring within him. "You're insane if you think I'll help you now." Ilara's tentacles twitched, a hint of irritation breaking through her icy facade. "You don't have a choice, human. Tell me where it is, or my men will—" Her words were cut off by a sudden violent tremor. The ground heaved and buckled, throwing them all off balance. Brian and Jack exchanged a look of pure dread. From the gaping hole they'd just escaped, something began to emerge. Massive, pulsating tendrils, slick with an oily sheen, burst forth from the depths. They coiled and writhed, as if searching for prey. Ilara's soldiers opened fire, energy bolts sizzling through the air. But the tendrils seemed to absorb the blasts, growing larger and more agitated with each impact. "Run!" Brian yelled, shoving Jack towards the Raven. They sprinted across the heaving ground, dodging the lashing appendages. Behind them, screams of terror and agony filled the air as the tendrils found their marks. Brian risked a glance over his shoulder. Ilara was grappling with a tendril, her face contorted in a rictus of fear and rage. Her men were being dragged one by one into the abyss, their cries cut short as they vanished into the darkness. Brian and Jack leapt into the Raven, slamming the hatch shut behind them. Jack threw himself into the pilot's seat, fingers flying over the controls. The engines roared to life, the small craft shuddering as it lifted off. As they rocketed away from the surface, Brian stared out the viewport in horror. Zeta Prime was transforming before his eyes, the once solid ground, now a seething mass of tendrils and pulsating flesh. It was as if the planet itself was coming alive, a monstrous entity awakening from an ancient slumber. "What have we done, Jack?" Brian whispered, his voice raw with dread. "What the hell did we unleash down there?" Jack just shook his head. his knuckles white on the controls. They watched in silence as the Odyssey grew larger in the view screen, a fragile bastion of safety amidst the nightmare they'd left behind. But even as they docked, Brian knew that this was far from over. The artifact, whatever it truly was, had set something in motion, something that threatened not just Zeta Prime, but perhaps the entire galaxy. And he had a sinking feeling that they were only just beginning to scratch the surface of the horrors that lay ahead. As the Raven docked with the Odyssey, Brian and Jack stumbled out, their hearts still pounding from the horrors they'd witnessed on Zeta Prime. But the nightmare was far from over. The ship's corridors, once pristine and familiar, now seemed alien and foreboding. The lights flickered erratically, casting eerie shadows on the walls. A low, pulsating hum reverberated through the deck plates, setting their teeth on edge. As they cautiously made their way deeper into the ship, a chilling realization dawned upon them. The crew members they'd left behind, their friends and colleagues, had undergone a horrific transformation. Their bodies were twisted and fused with the ship's technology, their faces contorted in a rictus of agony and madness. Brian shook his head, his grip tightening on his weapon. The same thing that happened to the denobulans, that artifact. It's changing everything it touches. Suddenly, a piercing shriek echoed through the corridor. One of the transformed crew members, a grotesque fusion of flesh and metal, lunged at them from the shadows. Brian and Jack opened fire, their weapons tearing through the abomination's twisted form. But there were more of them, emerging from every corner and crevice of the ship. The air was filled with the stench of burnt flesh and ozone as they fought their way through the horde, desperately searching for answers and a way to stop the spreading horror. As they battled their way to the bridge, they stumbled upon a chilling message left by Ethan before his disappearance. With trembling hands, Brian activated the recording, Ethan's face flickering to life on the screen. "If you're seeing this," Ethan's image said, his voice strained and haunted, "then I'm already gone. The artifact, it's not just a source of power. It's a conduit for something else, something ancient and malevolent." Brian and Jack exchanged a look of growing dread as Ethan continued, his words tumbling out in a rush. "It's an intelligence, a consciousness that seeks to assimilate all life in the universe. It transforms everything it touches, fusing organic matter with technology in a twisted mockery of evolution. The denobulans, they had no idea what they were dealing with, and now it's spreading beyond Zeta Prime, beyond this ship." Ethan's image flickered, distorting as if under the influence of some unseen force. "You have to warn them, Brian. Warn humanity. This thing, it won't stop until it's consumed everything. You have to find a way to stop it before it's too late." "And we have to get to the nearest outpost," he said, his voice raw with urgency. "We have to warn them before this thing spreads any further." But as they navigated the twisted corridors of the Odyssey, Brian felt a strange, insidious presence worming its way into his mind. It whispered dark thoughts, urging him to embrace the transformation, to let go of his humanity and become something more. He shook his head, gritting his teeth against the siren call of the ancient intelligence. Beside him, Jack's face was a mask of strain, his eyes haunted by the same unspoken struggle. They knew they had to resist, to hold on to their sanity and their humanity in the face of this all-consuming horror. But as the whispers grew louder, more insistent, Brian couldn't help but wonder. How long could they hold out against the siren call of the abyss? Brian and Jack fought through the twisted corridors of the Odyssey, their weapons flashing in the strobing emergency lights. The transformed crew members, once their friends and colleagues, now lunged at them with a ferocity that was both terrifying and heartbreaking. "We can't keep this up forever," Jack panted, his face slick with sweat and blood. "We need to find a way to stop this thing." Brian nodded grimly, his mind racing. As they battled their way to the ship's archives, a chilling realization dawned upon them. The ancient intelligence, which they had come to call the Amalgamation, was not confined to Zeta Prime. It had been seeding itself throughout the galaxy, lying dormant, waiting for the right moment to strike. The artifact was just a beacon, Brian said, his voice hollow with dread. A way for it to signal its awakening. With trembling hands, they managed to establish contact with the nearest human outpost. Admiral Nora Reeves, Ethan's mother, stared at them through the flickering view screen, her face etched with worry and disbelief. The words caught in Brian's throat. He forced himself to relay their terrifying findings, the horrors they had witnessed on Zeta Prime and the spreading influence of the amalgamation. Admiral Reeves listened, her face growing paler with each revelation. When the transmission ended, she steeled herself, a glint of determination in her eyes. "We'll mobilize every force we have," she said, "but I fear it may already be too late." As the Odyssey limped into the outpost's docking bay, Brian and Jack were immediately placed in quarantine, their minds and bodies subjected to a battery of scans and tests. The medics, clad in protective gear, moved around them with a wary efficiency, their faces masked and unreadable. In the sterile confines of the quarantine chamber, Brian and Jack learned of the spreading chaos. Reports of strange disturbances and disappearances flooded in from nearby colonies and outposts, each one more unsettling than the last. Admiral Reeves summoned them to a secure briefing room, her face drawn and haggard. She had aged years in the span of a few hours. "I need your help," she said, her voice tight with urgency. "You've seen this thing up close. You know what it's capable of. We need to find a way to stop it." But they were human, and they would not go down without a fight. As they pored over the outpost's databanks, searching for any clue or weakness they could exploit, Brian felt the weight of the galaxy on his shoulders. The amalgamation was out there, spreading its influence, corrupting flesh and machine alike, and they were the only ones who stood in its way. In the depths of the outpost, a strange stillness settled over the corridors. The usual bustle of activity had given way to an eerie quiet, broken only by the occasional flicker of malfunctioning lights. Brian and Jack, hunched over a console, felt a chill run down their spines. Something was wrong. Something was coming. And as the first screams echoed through the halls, they knew that their fight was far from over. In the depths of the human outpost, Brian and Jack huddled over a hollow table, their faces bathed in the eerie blue glow. Admiral Reeves stood across from them, her eyes shadowed with exhaustion and worry. "There has to be a way to stop this thing," Brian said, his voice low and urgent. "We can't let the amalgamation consume everything in its path." Jack nodded, his jaw tight. "We need to understand it, to find a weakness. It's the only way." Admiral Reeves sighed, rubbing her temples. "Our best minds are working on it, but we're running out of time. Every moment we delay, more lives are lost, more worlds are consumed." Brian leaned forward, a spark of determination in his eyes. "Then we need to go back to the source, to Zeta Prime." The room fell silent, the weight of his words hanging in the air. Admiral Reeves shook her head. "Brian, you barely made it out of there alive the first time. Going back would be suicide." But Brian was undeterred. "It's the only way, Admiral. We need to confront this thing head-on, to find a way to reverse the process. I've spent my life exploring the unknown. If anyone can find a way, it's me." Jack placed a hand on Brian's shoulder. "And I'll be right there with you." Admiral Reeves looked between them, her expression torn. She knew the risks, the odds stacked against them, but she also knew that time was running out. With a heavy sigh, she nodded. "All right. We'll assemble a team, the best of the best, and we'll outfit you with a ship designed to withstand the amalgamation's influence." The Nemesis was unlike any ship Brian had ever seen. Its hull was a sleek obsidian black, interlaced with pulsing veins of energy. The interior was a labyrinth of reinforced bulkheads and shielded conduits, every surface thrumming with power. As the team boarded, each member handpicked for their unique skills and resilience, Brian felt a flicker of hope amidst the dread. They were humanity's last stand, a desperate gambit against an unfathomable horror. The journey to Zeta Prime was a tense one, the crew moving about their tasks with a grim efficiency. As they approached the planet, the view screens flickered to life, revealing a sight that sent chills down their spines. Zeta Prime was no longer the hauntingly beautiful world they remembered. Its surface was a seething mass of flesh and metal, pulsating and writhing like a living thing. Tendrils of corrupted matter lashed out from the atmosphere, as if reaching out to ensnare the nemesis. Brian gripped the armrests of his chair, his knuckles white. "Take us in, but keep your distance. We don't know what this thing is capable of." As they descended through the turbulent atmosphere, the ship shuddered and groaned, its shields straining against the onslaught of twisted energy. The landscape below was a nightmare made real, a hellscape of fused organics and technology. The nemesis touched down on a jagged outcropping, the only stable ground amidst the sea of pulsating horror. Brian and Jack led the team out, their weapons at the ready. The moment their boots hit the ground, they were swarmed. Creatures that defied description, twisted amalgamations of flesh and machine, lunged at them from every direction. The team fought with a desperate ferocity, their weapons tearing through the abominations in sprays of ichor and sparks. But for every creature they felled, two more seemed to take its place. They were being driven back, forced towards the edge of the precipice. Brian gritted his teeth, his mind racing. "We need to find the artifact," he shouted over the din of battle. "It's the key to all of this." Jack nodded, his face streaked with sweat and grime. "The energy readings are strongest at the planet's core. That's where we need to go." The whispers were back, louder than ever, worming their way into his mind. He stumbled, his vision blurring. Beside him, Jack let out a cry of agony, clutching his head. The amalgamation was aware of their presence, and it was not happy. As they staggered into the tunnels, the whispers grew to a deafening roar, a cacophony of twisted voices and alien thoughts. Brian forced himself onward, his steps faltering, his mind reeling. The core was close, he could feel it. But with each step, the presence of the amalgamation grew stronger, its insidious influence seeping into his very being. Deep within the heart of Zeta Prime they found it, a pulsating mass of flesh and circuitry, a nightmare given form, the true face of the amalgamation, the source of the horror that threatened to consume the galaxy. As they stood before it, weapons raised, Brian felt a cold dread settle in his gut. The whispers were inside him now, a constant, insistent pressure, urging him to give in, to embrace the change. He looked to Jack, saw the same horror reflected in his friend's eyes. They were at the precipice, the fate of humanity balanced on a razor's edge. And as the amalgamation surged forward, a tidal wave of twisted flesh and metal, Brian knew that this was their last stand. They would fight. They would struggle. They would resist the siren call of the abyss. Or they would fall, and the galaxy would fall with them. As Brian and Jack fought their way towards the heart of the amalgamation, a sense of dread settled over them like a shroud. The pulsing, fleshy walls of the tunnels seemed to close in, the air thick with the stench of decay and the hum of malevolent energy. Suddenly they emerged into a vast chamber, its walls lined with pulsating circuitry and twisted organic machinery. And there, at the center of it all, stood a figure that made their blood run cold. It was Ethan, or at least what remained of him. His body had been warped and fused with the machinery of the core, his flesh melded with the pulsing alien technology. His eyes, once bright with intelligence and curiosity, now glowed with an eerie, inhuman light. "Welcome," the Ethan creature spoke, its voice a discordant mix of organic and mechanical tones. "I've been waiting for you." Brian and Jack stood frozen, their weapons trained on the abomination before them. "Ethan, what happened to you?" Brian managed to choke out. The creature laughed, a sound that sent shivers down their spines. "Ethan is gone, consumed by the perfection of the amalgamation, and now you have a choice to make." It stretched out a hand, a grotesque fusion of flesh and metal. "Join us willingly, become part of the new existence we will create, or be consumed, assimilated like all the others." Brian and Jack exchanged a glance, their minds straining against the insidious influence of the amalgamation. They could feel it, worming its way into their thoughts, whispering promises of power and perfection. But they knew the truth. They had seen the horror of the amalgamation's perfect existence, the twisted, screaming abominations that had once been human. They would not let that happen to them, or to the rest of humanity. "Go to hell," Brian spat and opened fire. The chamber erupted into chaos, the team pouring fire into the Ethan creature as it lunged at them, its form shifting and changing like liquid metal. They fought with desperation, knowing that this was their last chance to stop the amalgamation before it consumed everything. But the amalgamation was strong, and its influence was insidious. One by one, the team fell, their minds and bodies twisted and transformed by the ancient intelligence. Brian and Jack fought on, even as their ammunition ran low and their strength began to fail. In a last, desperate gambit, they managed to plant a series of explosive charges around the core, the creatures that had once been their friends clawing at them with every step. As they fought their way back to the surface, the charges detonated behind them, setting off a chain reaction that tore through the planet's core. The ground heaved and buckled beneath their feet, the pulsing flesh and circuitry of the amalgamation withering and dying as the core was destroyed. Brian and Jack ran, their lungs burning, their bodies pushed to the limit. They barely made it to the Nemesis, throwing themselves inside just as the planet began to collapse in on itself. The ship rocketed away, the shockwave of the implosion hot on its heels. As they watched Zeta Prime die through the viewscreen, a sickly green glow fading to black, Brian and Jack could only sit in stunned silence. They had won, but at what cost? Their friends, their crewmates, all consumed by the horror they had unleashed. And deep in the recesses of their minds, they could still feel it. The whisper of the amalgamation, the promise of perfection. They had escaped its grasp, but they knew that this was only the beginning. The fight against the amalgamation, against the twisted fusion of flesh and machine, was far from over, and they would be on the front lines, humanity's last hope against an enemy that sought to consume everything in its path. The Nemesis limped through the void, its hull scorched and battered, a testament to the horrors they had faced. Brian and Jack sat in the cockpit, their eyes haunted, their minds reeling from the events on Zeta Prime. The Nemesis limped through the void, its hull barely holding together. In the cockpit, Brian and Jack sat in silence, their faces gaunt and haunted. The weight of the horrors they'd witnessed pressed down on them like a physical force. They had won, but the cost had been too high. Their friends, their crewmates, all lost to the nightmare that was the amalgamation. And now, as the adrenaline faded and the reality of their situation set in, they were left with nothing but the scars on their bodies and the darkness in their minds. The journey back to the outpost was a blur, a haze of pain and exhaustion. When they finally docked, they were met with a flurry of activity, medics rushing to assess their injuries, technicians swarming over the battered ship, officers demanding answers. Brian and Jack were swept away to debriefing, their minds still reeling from the events on Zeta Prime. They sat through hours of questioning, recounting every detail of the mission, every horror they'd faced. But as the days turned into weeks, they began to notice something strange. The reports coming in from across the galaxy, stories of strange disturbances and unexplained disappearances, seemed to hint at a disturbing truth. The destruction of Zeta Prime, the defeat of the amalgamation's core, it had not been the end. If anything, it seemed to have only been the beginning. Brian and Jack underwent test after test, their bodies and minds probed for any sign of contamination, and as they sat in the sterile rooms of the outpost's medical wing, they began to hear whispers. Whispers of a conspiracy, of a plot that went deeper than they ever could have imagined. They heard talk of Admiral Reeves, of how she had been acting strangely in the days leading up to the mission, of how she had pushed for Brian and Jack to be sent to Zeta Prime despite the risks. And then, one night, they overheard a conversation that chilled them to the bone. Two officers speaking in hushed tones outside their door. It was all a setup, one of them said. The amalgamation wanted them to go to Zeta Prime. It wanted them to bring it back here, to the heart of human space. Brian and Jack looked at each other, their eyes wide with horror. They knew then that they could trust no one, that the very people they had sworn to protect might have been compromised by the very thing they had fought against. They made their decision that night, as they lay in their beds staring at the ceiling. They would steal a ship, a small, unremarkable vessel that wouldn't be missed, and they would disappear into the depths of space, hunting down any remnant of the amalgamation, any hint of its insidious influence. It was a suicide mission, they knew, but what choice did they have? They had seen the face of the enemy, and they knew that they could never rest until it was destroyed, no matter the cost. As they slipped out of the outpost in the dead of night, the stolen ship humming beneath them, Brian and Jack knew that they were leaving behind everything they had ever known. Their homes, their families, their very identities, all would be sacrificed in the name of the mission. But they also knew that they had no choice. The amalgamation was still out there, waiting, plotting, its influence spreading like a cancer through the stars, and they were the only ones who could stop it. As the outpost faded behind them, and the vast emptiness of space stretched out before them, Brian and Jack settled into their new roles. They were no longer explorers, no longer heroes. They were hunters now, stalking their prey across the galaxy, their minds and bodies forever altered by the horrors they had faced. And somewhere out there, in the depths of the void, the amalgamation waited, its malevolent intelligence seething and twisting, ready to strike again at the heart of humanity. Brian and Jack's stolen ship drifted through the inky blackness of space, the only sound the gentle hum of the engines and the occasional beep of the navigational systems. They had been traveling for days, putting as much distance as possible between themselves and the outpost, following the faint trail of strange energy signatures and distress signals that hinted at the amalgamation's presence. Brian sat in the cockpit, his eyes fixed on the readouts before him. His face was gaunt, his beard unkempt. He had hardly slept since they left, his mind haunted by visions of twisted flesh and pulsing machinery. Jack entered, 2 steaming cups of coffee in hand. He set one down next to Brian, taking a seat in the co-pilot's chair. "Anything?" he asked, his voice rough from disuse. Brian shook his head. "Nothing concrete, just more ghost stories and rumors. But we keep following the breadcrumbs." Jack took a sip of his coffee, wincing at the bitter taste. "Do you think we're doing the right thing, going off on our own like this?" Jack nodded, his own memories of the horrors on Zeta Prime flashing through his mind. "I just keep thinking about the others. Ethan, the crew, they deserved better." Brian's grip tightened on the controls. "We all did. But we're the only ones left who can make sure their sacrifices weren't in vain. We have to keep fighting no matter what." They lapsed into silence, the weight of their mission hanging heavy in the air. They were chasing ghosts, hunting a nightmare that had nearly destroyed them once already. But they had no choice. Suddenly an alarm blared through the ship, red lights flashing on the console. Brian leaned forward, his eyes widening. Jack leaned in, studying the readouts. "Could be a trap," he warned. Brian nodded. "Could be, but it's the best lead we've had in weeks. We have to check it out." He punched in the coordinates, the ship's engines thrumming as they accelerated towards the source of the signal. They knew they were heading into danger, that they could be walking straight into the jaws of the beast they had sworn to destroy. But they also knew that they had no choice. The amalgamation was out there, and they would not rest until they had hunted it down and eradicated it from the galaxy, no matter the cost. As the ship hurtled through the void, Brian and Jack steeled themselves for what lay ahead. They checked their weapons, the same ones they had carried on Zeta Prime, now battered and scarred from the battles they had fought. They went over the plan again and again, running through every possible scenario, every potential danger. They knew that they were walking into the unknown, that they could be facing horrors beyond their darkest imaginings. But they were ready. They had to be. The fate of humanity hung in the balance, and they were the only ones left who could tip the scales. As they approached the system, the distress signal growing stronger with each passing moment, Brian and Jack exchanged a final look. No words were spoken, none were needed. They knew what they had to do. You have reached the end of the story. If you enjoyed this story and want to support us, please leave a like and subscribe to our channel, and for every comment that says 88, I will heart every single one of them. Thank you for your time.